We're going to move on now to Jonathan Cook. Now, I know that many of my comrades in Bristol enjoy reading your articles, Jonathan. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So both Moshe and Deepa were referring to, as you yourself were, the power imbalance, and were referencing the British establishment's role here alongside the Israel lobby, which is a very important point that we need to bear in mind. But I also wanted maybe to refocus and think a little bit about the audience that is created after we get these kind of imbalance of power, where their narratives are being created. They have an impact and they create an audience. And we have to think, I think, when we're thinking about questions like academic freedom and the plight of David Miller, and not him alone, of course, there's been an assault not just on academic freedom, but also on our cultural and political lives. We can draw parallels with what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, what's been happening to Ken Loach and others, and to Moshe himself. There's an all-round assault on public life. And I think we need to think a little bit about why there is an audience, and maybe think also what we can do to challenge some of the assumptions. I'm going to stray, I'm afraid, maybe a little bit away from political activism, more to psychoanalysis. I think we need to think a little bit about why these narratives that are created by the lobby, by the British establishment, resonate and how they work. And issues like, I suppose, cognitive dissonance, which struck me rather deeply just the other day when I tweeted about this, when the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, announced that he was going to try and outlaw no platforming by universities, implying that he therefore regards free speech in academia to be a supreme value. But at the same time, he's also demanding that universities no platform critics of Israel, presumably because he thinks that Israel is the only academic issue where free speech should be denied. So he's holding two contradictory thoughts in his head, assuming that he's not being entirely cynical and speaking in bad faith. But certainly not all Zionists, I think, are acting in bad faith or being cynical. They believe what they're saying. And I think we need to understand why that is, and maybe focus on what is this core cognitive dissonant Achilles heel, if you like, to improve our own activism, our own challenging of this narrative that is created and this audience that is created for this power establishment narrative. It seems to me that Zionists hold dear two important values, which are irreconcilable. And that is one of the reasons that they're so emotionally invested in us as political activists or as academics or as journalists, not challenging these values, not exposing or scrutinizing them. And I think maybe the clearest illustration of that, one that I'm very aware of living here in Nazareth inside Israel, is I call it a Zionist motto, the idea that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, the idea that this is entirely unproblematic. You hear this a lot in Israel, people talking about a Jewish and democratic state. In the UK, maybe people talk about it more as Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East. But this is really clearly something that's very important to Zionists to believe this, even though to me it seems an entirely fantastical claim that Israel is some kind of normal liberal democracy. The question here is, what does Jewish mean in Jewish state? Does it mean Jewish in a religious sense? Then I think we can point to obvious problems. Nobody suggests that it's possible to have an Islamic and democratic state or a Christian and democratic state. These are clearly problematic ideas. Does it mean Jewish in an ethnic sense? But this seems equally problematic. We could have the idea of a white democratic state. In fact, we've been there before, so we know that this doesn't work either. So it sounds oxymoronic to us, but to Zionists, it doesn't seem that way. It's unproblematic for them. And that's because for them, and Israel has encouraged this, this view, the Zionist movement before it has encouraged this view, the idea is that Jewish means something different. It doesn't mean, it blends these ideas or obscures these ideas of religious and ethnic to create a new idea of a Jewish nation. Now, the problems in that were illustrated many years ago when one of Israel's most famous Supreme Court judges, Meir Shamgar, concluded in one of his court rulings that Israel was a Jewish state in exactly the same way that France is a French state. Now, this doesn't withstand the simplest scrutiny either. How can being Jewish be the same as being French? I can become French by immigrating to France and naturalizing, but I can't do that to become a Jew in that way. The only way I can become a Jew is by converting. So they're clearly not equivalencies at all. Now, how is it that a venerated judge like Meir Shamgar is incapable of grasping the difference between a French nationality and a supposed Jewish nationality? I think we can understand it because he was deeply emotionally invested in the idea of a Jewish state being a normal state, being like a French state. And therefore, he couldn't afford to understand that there was a difference between these two things. Now, I think this is one of the problems for us, which is that in an era of 24-hour rolling news, social media, a much more interconnected world in the digital age, it's very hard to be a Zionist. There's just too much information out there showing you that a lot of your beliefs are simply irreconcilable. Your idea that Israel is Jewish and democratic just doesn't really make sense when it has to confront the reality of what's going on. Now, I spend a lot of my time as a journalist covering these kinds of problems for Israel, how it tries to manage its image and how the evidence, the reality just shows that it's not possible to do so. And I just wanted to plot some of those recent events. I think over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a lot of illustrations of how, if you're a British Jew, for instance, it's extremely hard to maintain the idea that Israel is a normal liberal democratic state. Just to identify a few of the major ones, in 2018, Israel passed the nation state law, which gives a right only to Jews to have self-determination in the region, denies that to Palestinians. It sets out a clear ideology of Jewish supremacism. Last year, we saw the Netanyahu government proposing annexation, which was apparently stopped only because some Gulf states like the UAE decided that they were going to do a so-called peace deal with Israel to stop this. But still, whether we want to name it annexation or not, clearly some kind of de facto annexation has been going on. It's been going on for decades and it's intensifying. And that means that the occupation is becoming permanent. Israel isn't even talking about ending it. It's just talking about a moment in which it decides that it's going to formally annex the occupied territories. We can see it in the recent report just in January by B'Tselem saying that Israel is an apartheid state, because if occupation is permanent, then Israel has created a permanent system of apartheid rule across the region. We don't have two separate areas, one democratic and one non-democratic. It's all not democratic, it's an apartheid system. Then last month, we had the International Criminal Court's decision to investigate Israel for war crimes, including settlements that have been built by every Israeli government over more than 5 decades. We had the decision last month also by the Jewish National Fund, the most venerable of the Zionist institutions, to publicly allocate funds to the settlements. That's, in other words, to subsidize what the International Criminal Court may soon decree to be war crimes. So traditionally, the Jewish National Fund has tried to conceal its involvement in the occupied territories. Isn't something particularly new, but it has concealed it. And the reason it's done that is because it relies on the donations from Jews all around the world, Zionist Jews, to promote its activities, to finance its activities. So now those Jews who are making donations to the Jewish National Fund will be subsidizing directly and explicitly war crimes. And then only yesterday, I wrote a report about Israel's or Netanyahu's decision to make an electoral pact with the Jewish Power Party, which is Israel's version of the Ku Klux Klan, to ensure they get into the Israeli parliament. So just to take these few examples over the last couple of years, and some of them just the last couple of weeks, we can see there's a constant onslaught, a barrage of real-world evidence that should shake any Zionist Jew to their core as they try and hold on to the belief that Israel is a normal liberal democratic state. So there's a message here in these news events that Zionism is actually a racist, Jewish supremacist, settler colonial ideology. And if you're living in Britain and you identify with Israel, if you want to defend Israel, you have a problem. Now, that doesn't mean that every Zionist in Britain is consciously racist or Jewish supremacist. The ideology may be that. And of course, it's true that many British Jews do not understand what the state is doing in their name. And they may avoid trying to understand that. They may avert their eyes. And there are a variety of reasons why they might do that. And they're not unique to being a Zionist Jew. All of us are capable of this kind of evasion, attempts to try and deal with their own cognitive dissonance. But just to go through some of them, they may not know or understand what is being done in their names. They may find it hard to undo the social, cultural, and ideological programming they've experienced throughout their lives, as have all of us. They may be reluctant to examine or question assumptions on which they've built their wider value system. They may wish to avoid conflict with family, friends, their community, which would be the inevitable outcome of thinking critically and independently on these questions. Or they may prefer to prioritize their fears over reality on the premise that any alternative path, even if it were the right things to do, appears to them to be too risky or costly. Now, psychologists say that cognitive dissonance, the holding or expressing of contradictory ideas at the same time, causes discomfort, stress, and anxiety. Isn't this exactly the visceral reaction that Zionist Jews invested in Israel feel when critics try to talk honestly and frankly about what Israel is and what Zionism means? Isn't this precisely what they're referring to when they accuse us of causing them offense? The problem isn't that we're causing offense. The problem is that those who are offended are unwilling to examine their investment in the act of taking offense. That's illustrated in the refusal by Israel's supporters to allow any scrutiny, any questioning of their contradictory beliefs, such as the idea that Israel is both Jewish and democratic at the same time. The offense argument is too often an implicit admission that they can't justify their beliefs, that they can't square the circle. The responsibility of journalists, of public figures, and of academics like David Miller is not to indulge the pretense that this circle can be squared. It's to articulate our most valid, our most credible assessments of events of the real world, and then test our arguments and claims against those of others. And to do that, we need a level playing field of the kind that universities almost uniquely are supposed to offer. When critics of Israel seek to shine a light where darkness reigns, we threaten strategies of ignorance and evasion, whether individual or communal. Zionists therefore act to shut down critics at all costs in ways that can protect their contradictory beliefs and values. They denounce us as anti-Semites and self-hating Jews. The simplest and easiest, most satisfying solution is to avoid our arguments. It is to reject not what we say, but who we are. David is the latest victim of that campaign, but clearly he won't be the last one. The attacks on David are not simply about shutting down individuals. Their aim is to shut down an entire debate about what Israel is, what it does, and what that means for a colonized, much abused people, the Palestinians. I'll end it there for the time being.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, I don't think I need maybe to address Rada's point because Moshe did it very well. I just say that, yes, the problem is that Zionist Jews have absorbed Israel into their identity. And it seems to me that that emotional investment derives from fear that has been generated in them by decades of propaganda, by the Zionist movement and by Israel. And so what's happening here is that the lobby is weaponizing our truth telling. I mean, it's weaponizing anti-Semitism, but what it's trying to do is make the truth we tell sound sinister and dangerous to Zionist Jews. So they're trying to create a vicious cycle for us here. The more truth we tell, the more afraid British Jews are supposed to feel. And as Moshe says, that fear comes from ignorance, doesn't it? So the strongest medicine we have is to speak our truth clearly, rationally, precisely, and make sure we don't engage in half measures, because half measures can be used and turned against us. So, I mean, the lobby feeds off our half measures, and I think that was a lesson that maybe the supporters of Jeremy Corbyn should have learned if they didn't learn it from his experience. The other thing I wanted to address was Tina's point about she noted that criticizing Israel now comes at a cost, and that's undoubtedly true. But I also think we should remember that it comes at a cost now because we have a bigger voice than we've ever had before. I think most of the people here are old enough. I mean, I talk to a lot of student groups and I have to tell them what it was like 20 years ago because they don't know. But, you know, we're all old enough, or most of us are old enough, to know that 20 years ago, the best people like us, the best we could hope for was getting a letter in the Guardian letters page. You know, that was the most of a voice that you had on a platform that wasn't a town hall meeting. So, or maybe you could get yourself an article in a newsletter that was published 3 times a year and went to 50 people. You know, that was really that was our tiny weapon against the enormous power of the corporate billionaire media. And we have a much bigger weapon now. Okay, it's not perfect. You know, I'm not the biggest fan of social media and all the rest of it, but we do have the internet. We have, as long as these corporations continue to let us use these platforms, we have the ability to reach out, to educate ourselves in ways that were never true before, share information, to organize. These are tools that are vitally important. So the reason we're seeing this backlash, the reason that we're being criticized, we're being attacked, we're being smeared like never before, is because we have more power than ever before. We have an ability to reach out and engage with each other and share information as we've never had, as maybe no humans have ever had before. So let's take advantage of this moment to tell our truth and to speak clearly, confidently, boldly, and not engage in half measures. And again, solidarity with David, and thank you for inviting me on this platform.
Thank you, Jonathan. Solidarity and no half measures, definitely messages we'll take away from today.